Bonnie from Hedgecraft Heirlooms, and someday I will actually not trip over that. Today we're here to do 20th Century Witchcraft, the 1930s edition, and I'm super excited to be here today to do this. This is the technically third installment of the 20th Century Witchcraft series, and it's just super fun, and I love sharing it with you guys. So to start off, while we're waiting for folks to show up, again, if you're here watching on the replay, hashtag replay. If you're here watching live, like Ella is just now, who just showed up, hashtag live. It helps the algorithm kind of reach out its little fingers and find other people who would like to watch with you. That said, while we're waiting, I am going to do a little bit of reading from a document that's called the Humanist Manifesto, and I'm actually noticing here that I don't already have it written down on here. I kind of totally was running behind here and was scrambling to get everything ready. So let me just find that. Humanist, I think that I actually have it linked in here somewhere. Here we go. Yeah, go to the place, do the thing. Excellent. Thank you so much for your patience for my relative disorganization. So the Humanist Manifesto, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in the stream. Hey Brooke, we're here to talk about the 1930s, but one of the things I want to do in our pre-show while we wait for more folks to show up, thank you for the hashtag live, is I'm going to do some readings from a document called the Humanist Manifesto. And the Humanist Manifesto was published in 1933, that's what I thought. And a lot of the tenets that are in this particular document, in my opinion, are things that very much made the transition over to what turned into ultimately neo-paganism. There's a lot of parallels. Of course, it's not exactly the same, and the humanist organization, it does still exist, but it is very, very similar to a lot of the things that we kind of hold dear and true today. So I figured I would read some of them so you guys can kind of see how crazy related it is. So let's see. let's see. I'm trying to see this. I like this one. So this is the second bullet point. It says, humanism believes that man is a part of nature and that he has emerged as a result of a continuous process. So basically, I think they mean as opposed to the idea of creationism. Where we've evolved into where we are now as opposed to just popping into being. Let me see. There are some things in here too, a lot of humanism kind of rejects the idea of religion or God entirely. So a lot of these kind of talk about that. So they're again, similar but different. I'm trying to of course I, again, wasn't smart enough to write these down exactly. Man will learn to face the crises of life in terms of his knowledge for their naturalness. Hey, Michelle, we're talking about the 1930s today. And probability. Reasonable and manly attitudes will be fostered. Now, mind you, this is written by a lot of old white dudes originally. Reasonably and manly attitudes will be fostered by education and supported by custom. We assume that humanism will take the path of social and mental hygiene and discourage sentimental and unreal hopes and wishful thinking. Which again, again, the language is very dated, but the idea, I believe, was suggesting that people take a realistic approach to things as opposed to a religio-spiritual approach. And this is just me, at least in my practice. I put a lot of value on science as sort of a way to sort of explain my beliefs as opposed to, relying solely on faith. To me, the science should be supporting what I believe and not ruining it, if that makes any sense. And if it does, quote unquote, ruin it, then it calls for an adjustment to what I've been kind of assuming. And that's kind of what I'm getting out of this here. And I like this one. Believing that religion must work increasingly for joy in living, religious humanists aid to foster the creative in man and encourage achievements that add to the satisfactions of life. So basically what I'm getting, and I think, again, I'm translating a little bit, the idea here is that, the ideal life is lived in the present, not with the expectation of some, great reward at the end of life, that things should be enjoyed now. Let's see what else. Some of these ones at the end here get very, very long. Oh, hold on. What's this one? I like this. The humanists are firmly convinced that existing acquisitive and profit-motivated society has shown itself to be inadequate, and that a radical change in methods, controls, and motives must be instituted. So they're totally throwing shade at like the modern like financial and economical system of the time, and which is kind of the same as it is today, or very, very similar. A socialized and cooperative economic order must be established to the end that the equitable distribution of the means of life be possible. Sound a little bit socialist, anybody? The goal of humanism is a free and universal society in which people voluntarily and intelligently cooperate for the common good. Humanists demand a share of life in a shared world. And I think that that's very, very, again, this is an old document, but I feel like the language in this one very much is akin to what a lot of us are looking for today, and hoping that, the current administration in our country, or my country at least, is heading towards, hopefully. All right. So that said, it's been a couple minutes. I've bored you with this enough. If you want to go and read it, you can always ask me. I will send you a link. But let's talk about the 1930s, because that's what everybody came here for. I just realized that I haven't been on Facebook to see if anybody's here. Again, if you're watching and you're here live and you haven't already done it, #live, #replay, and comment. It helps other people find us, especially if you're on Facebook, because on Facebook, it doesn't show me who you are. It doesn't show me who's here, and I want to say hello. So let's start with historical and cultural events that happened in the 1930s, because there are a lot of really big things that happened that influenced, all the things that we're about to talk about. First of all was the Great Depression. The Great Depression happened in the 1930s. In general, but the inciting incident for the Great Depression was the great stock market crash of 1929, also called Black Tuesday. So and I have this quote here, between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 banks closed in the U.S., taking with them more than $2.5 billion in deposits. Meanwhile, unemployed people did whatever they could, like standing in charity bread lines and selling apples on street corners to feed their families, which is also disturbingly similar to today in some ways. But that was a really big thing, and part of that in the beginning of the 1920s, there was one president in office whose name, of course, is not coming to me. It might have been Hoover, but don't quote me on that. And FDR actually took office after him in the middle of the 1930s, which was a really, really big deal because he was instrumental to helping to bring the country out of the Great Depression with a group of laws and bills called the New Deal. So if you've ever heard the term the Green New Deal, which people talk about today, it's a riff on this that happened in the 1930s. And basically what it did is it created jobs. It also created the Social Security system that we work with and we still have today. So that's a really, really big thing. And then, of course, and I didn't write about it too much on here, but the other thing that happened, too, of course, in the 1930s is the Holocaust. My whole blog this week was talking about the Silver Legion in great part. So the Silver Legion, if you're not familiar, was actually basically an American Nazi organization run by a man named William Dudley Pelley. And in his early life, he was actually a Hollywood writer, but he fancied himself a leader and really appreciated... Hey, Siren and Luna. We're here talking about 1930s in the 20th century witchcraft. So we're just talking about, I'll just kind of give people a run over of some of the cultural events that happened during that time. And again, if you're here watching, if you want to throw a #live into the comments or #replay, so especially if you're on Facebook, so I can say hello, because I have them running simultaneously. But the Silver Legion, it was founded in 1932 by William Pelley Dudley, or just Dudley as I'm going to be calling him from here on out. And he thought that it was high time for there to be an American Hitler, and he fancied himself that guy. So he created this organization called the Silver Legion, which became rather prolific. Not as much as they could have been. A lot of history's kind of forgotten the Silver Legion a little bit. I think it willfully, honestly, because they didn't want to think about it. But it was a thing that happened, and I think that, and in my blog I talk about this more about, I feel like it was part of what led to the level of disbelief and discredit around the occult that we even kind of still experience to some degree today was in part based on him, because he was a little out there, but he was also espousing some of those ideas, and so they kind of became linked in a way, again, culturally. But Pelly also had a lot of really strong occult beliefs. I obviously just suggested that. He believed in things like mediumship and astral projection and meditation and things like that. And, so his work with the Silver Legion was very closely tied to those things. And at some point, I think it was in 1929, he had this spiritual experience where he claimed to have met these ascended masters, including Jesus Christ, who basically told him that white people are better and Jews and blacks are bad. And he just ran with it his whole life, actually. But it started with the Silver Legion and him sort of preaching those ideas to the public. And, but then of course it was very anti-Semitic. A lot of people joined the Silver Legion not because of their anti-Semitic sentiment, but because of the occult ties and wanting to learn more about that side of it. And they just kind of, brushed aside the anti-Semitism so that they could learn about magic. But ultimately what ended up happening was in 1942, which is technically out of the 1930s, but just as a sense so we can kind of have some resolution to this fun part of the story. He was convicted in 1942 of insurrection and sedition, and he went to jail for 15 years, and then he has a whole other crazy stuff that he did after the fact. But in relation to the Silver Legion, that was kind of when that came to an end. He disbanded it in 1939, I believe, because of a lot of pressure from the government, and he knew they were watching him, and he just didn't want to deal with it anymore. And I think they grew to upwards of around 1,500 members all in all. So some scary stuff. So that's a thing that happened in the 1930s. Some other kind of notable figures and publications that took place in the 1930s was The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which was in 1938. So if you're not familiar with The War of the Worlds, and also you might be, but maybe not by name. So in the 1930s, radio was huge. It was the biggest form of free entertainment. And since we were in the middle of a depression and people couldn't really spend money, the radio was the only thing that they could really go to, for the most part, in order to get their news, to get their information, and to be entertained. So the War of the Worlds was actually a radio show. But they didn't tell everybody it was a radio show ahead of time or promote it at all. They just aired it, and the show starts off by a newscast, and the whole point is that aliens are taking over the world. And it was a big hysteria very, very briefly, because a lot of people didn't realize that it was entertainment purely. They thought it was really, really happening, and it was this big sort of cultural phenomena that took place as the War of the Worlds. And I don't know why I put that in here. And I think that I have this just bulleted wrong. Another thing that happened in the 1930s, kind of, sort of, we talked about Gerald Gardner in the Wicca and Witchcraft community. He didn't really do his writing until the 1950s. However, a lot of the information that he wrote about in his book, he claimed to have acquired in the 1930s, somewhere in England. I couldn't find anything more specific than that, as much as I would have liked to. But the 1930s to the 1950s really was sort of a slow burn as far as publications relating to witchcraft or paganism. So they were released, slowly and what was happening around this time was that interest in Eastern religion, like Buddhism and Hinduism, were becoming more and more popular. And Saxon, Celtic, English, Norse, religion, spirituality were becoming much more and more popular as far as people being academically interested in it. So things were published slowly, but there weren't a lot of really big monumental things that I was able to find that were published at that time. But they were happening. Lots of little things were coming out. But one of the big things that came out, which I mentioned at the very, very beginning, I did a little bit of reading from it, is the Humanist Manifesto, which was published in 1933. It was also signed by 33 men. And they recognized a need to set and create a set of morals and beliefs that were not based around God, or the Christian God especially. And there were values that continue to be cherished and adhered to by a lot of modern day pagans. The version that I was reading earlier was the 1933 version. Of course, they've updated it and changed it lots of times between now and then. If you go to the Humanist website, you can probably find I'm sure actually that you can find the newest version if you want to check it out for yourself. In pop culture, one of the big things that was happening was swing music. The 1920s was generally considered to be the jazz era. Well, the 1930s was the swing era. So swing music was a really big thing. And again, radio was really popular, of course, too. So, music was a really big part of the culture of the time, especially the swing and the jazz. The 1930s was also considered to be the golden age of Hollywood. The theater was popular in spite of all of the economic issues with the Depression and things that were going on, which I think is kind of an interesting reflection on how even in the worst of times, humans feel the need to distract themselves. And it reminds me very much of how today we are treating Netflix in the middle of a pandemic. But the careers of some of the most iconic Hollywood performers flourished in the 1930s. People like Greta Garbo, Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, Mae West, the Marx Brothers, Errol Flynn, who was best known for his role as Robin Hood, and child star Shirley Temple, and Charlie Chaplin, of course. At that point in time, he was the great star of the silent era. At that point was when he kind of successfully transitioned into sound film. And of course, one of the biggest things to kind of hit witches, so to speak, in the 1930s was in 1939 when The Wizard of Oz was released. I think a lot of us watch The Wizard of Oz once a year. It's a big deal. So prior to The Wizard of Oz being released, it was very common that witches were depicted with either normal skin, or maybe their skin was a little bit orange or a little bit red, but never green. So the reason why the Wicked Witch of the West was depicted with green skin is because color TV was actually really, really new. And they were trying to find a way to make her look otherworldly. And when they tried oranges and reds, they didn't really show up that well on screen. And they kind of on a whim really chose to try green on her skin and just fell in love with it. And as a result of the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz in 1939 being depicted with green skin, we now have the kind of cultural idea of the witch with green skin. That's actually where it comes from, 1939, which is actually really recent. So that's kind of neat too. And then some other things, so that's kind of what I have for... Ooh, I inhaled to spit. That was fun. Excuse me. Some other things, popular motifs as far as in style and decor in the 1930s, kind of moving past all the neo-pagan witch stuff. There was, last time we did the 1920s. In the 1930s, there was sort of a continuation of Art Deco, which started in the 1920s, but really picked up a lot of steam in the 1930s. And Art Deco, if you don't remember, is sort of defined as simple shapes combined with striking color and abstractions to suggest very old artistic styles from Egypt, Africa, and even the Aztecs. So it's very geometric. There has to be a lot of symmetry. And the versions of Art Deco pieces that came out in the 1930s are a lot of what led to modern art as we know it today. Things like Cubism, Art Nouveau, Neoclassical, Futurism, etc., especially with all the really clean sort of geometric lines that it tended to have. And the style of the Art Deco in the 1930s is very, very easy to see if you look at images of the Empire State Building. That is a very Art Deco building, 1930s style. And some other ones include the Chrysler Building and the Strand Hotel in London. And of course, in the 1930s too, home decor started to take a really big shift. People were weren't working, so they had a lot of time to kick around the house and decorate and nest. Which again, kind of like today, right? So it kind of, it kind of brought on this sort of new aesthetic that people were working with, and it was based a lot on practicality and simplicity over, a more ornate style, and it, became very, very quickly popular because it was sort of no nonsense. Well, this is a chair and it's not fancy; it's just to sit on. It was very pragmatic. And that kind of set the tone for the entire rest of the century as far as decor is concerned, if not at least the rest of the decade. From that point forward, things were a lot less fancy and ornate in their construction and design. And one of the things I wrote on here is sort of how to describe the 1930s Art Deco home design is sort of like Art Deco from the 1920s meets mid-century modern, which is actually more like 50s, which, trust me, we're going to talk about that when we get there because I love mid-century modern stuff. So, but that said, that is all I have for the 1930s today. Real quick before I head into our live sale and do one-card tarot card readings for the folks that want them, I'm going to do a quick little sign off because eventually, a little while after I wrap up this today, I'm going to upload this Instagram video to my YouTube. But I like to cut off the end part because they don't want to watch all this stuff at the end. So that said, if you're here watching on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us. It's been so great to have you. This has been 20th Century Witchcraft 1930s edition. Please continue to join us. We do Friday live at 4 every week. And I'm sure in a few weeks we'll probably be doing the 1940s. So if you really love this series, make sure that you hit subscribe and you hit the little bell so you get a notification for when that comes live too. So blessed be, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.